Welcome to another deep dive. Today we're going way back in time, to the foggy streets of Victorian London, to explore, you probably guessed it from the intro music, the mystery of Jack the Ripper. We're going to try to understand why this case, even over 135 years later, still has this hold on us. And we've got some really cool material to help us out. We're going to be checking out excerpts from a couple of websites. One is called Jack the Ripper History, Victims, Letters, Suspects. Pretty straightforward, right? And then, of course, we've got to check out the Wikipedia page on the topic. Never hurts to see what the hive mind has to say.
It's wild how much this case still fascinates people, isn't it? I mean, Jack the Ripper's reign of terror was pretty short, relatively speaking, and the number of victims we can definitely attribute to him. Not that many compared to, some modern serial killers.
So why is that? Why is Jack the Ripper like the household name for a killer, even after all this time?
Well, you got to think about the setting, for one. Victorian London, particularly the East End, it was seen as like this dark, dangerous underbelly of society. Poverty, crime, vice, you name it. And Jack the Ripper, right, he was lurking in those shadows. He became a symbol of all those anxieties, a real-life boogeyman.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
And the name itself, Jack the Ripper,
Mm-hmm.
it's simple, but man, it's chilling.
Mm.
It's just like instantly you're thinking about brutality and mystery. But did he actually call himself that?
Probably not. It was most likely a journalist trying to make the story even more sensational, which, worked, obviously, because the name stuck. Jack the Ripper. It's iconic. And that definitely played a huge role in turning him into, like, a media sensation.
Yeah, it's like they were creating a brand, a villain for everyone to be scared of and obsess over.
Exactly. And the newspapers at the time, they were just starting to really, really get into sensationalism, And the Ripper case was perfect for that. They published all these crazy details about the murders, sometimes exaggerating, sometimes even making stuff up, and all these wild theories and speculation. It was crazy. It was actually, you could argue, the beginning of the 24-hour news cycle that we know today.
Wow, I never thought of it that way. So
Yeah.
basically, the media frenzy was a huge part of making Jack the Ripper. Well, Jack the Ripper. But it all started with the murders, right? The
Yeah.
actual crimes. So what can you tell us about them?
Okay, so first, a little clarification. The term Whitechapel murders, that actually refers to 11 brutal murders that all happened in the Whitechapel district of London. But this was between 1888 and 1891, so a few years. And only 5 of those are generally thought to be Jack the Ripper's work. These are, they're called the canonical 5.
The canonical 5? Why those 5 specifically?
It comes down to the similarities, right? The victims and how they were killed. The canonical 5, they were all women. And they were all killed in a similar way. Their throats were cut, and a lot of them had some really awful abdominal mutilations. And all that, combined with when and where the murders happened, led investigators to think they were dealing with one killer.
So even figuring out what's part of the case and what's not is part of the whole mystery. Okay, tell me about these victims then.
Who are they? Okay, so the canonical 5 are Marianne Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Jane Kelly. Each of these women had a life, a life that was tragically cut short. And their murders, they took place between August 31st and November 9th of 1888. Those are the ones that really, got people's attention and made them scared. They established that chilling pattern of the Ripper's, his MO.
Right. Let's start at the beginning then, with Marianne Nichols, the first of the canonical 5. What do we know about her case?
Well, Marianne Nichols' body was found in the very early hours of August 31st, 1888, in a place called Bucks Row. Her throat had been cut twice, actually, really deeply, severing everything down to her vertebrae. And there were 2 stab wounds to her vagina, and then this deep, jagged wound that basically ripped open her abdomen.
God, that's awful. And that was just the beginning. What about Annie Chapman, the second victim?
Annie Chapman's body was found just a week later, September 8th, in the backyard of 29 Hanbury Street. And it was, the brutality was even worse. Her throat was cut. Yeah. But her abdomen was totally cut open. And there was a section of flesh from her stomach. It had been placed on her left shoulder. And parts of her skin and flesh, along with her intestines, were removed and placed above her right shoulder.
So it seems like the killer was getting, I don't know, more confident, more brazen with each murder.
That's a good observation, actually. It's something we see in a lot of cases like this. There's an escalation of violence as the murders go on.
Okay. What about Elizabeth Stride, the third victim? Her case was a little different, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was. Elizabeth Stride's body was found in a yard off Burner Street on September 30th, 1888. The same night, actually, only 45 minutes later, Catherine Eddowes' body was found in Mitre Square.
Wait, so two murders in one night. What happened?
Yeah, this is called the double event, and it basically terrified everyone in London. Now, Elizabeth Stride, her injuries were mostly limited to one deep slash across her neck. Some people who study this case, ripperologists they're called, think the killer was interrupted before he could do those awful abdominal mutilations that were his signature.
Oh, wow. So maybe someone saw him or something spooked him and he ran off.
Yeah, it's possible, but we'll never know for sure. But Catherine Eddowes, she wasn't so lucky. Her throat was cut ear to ear. Her abdomen was ripped open. Her intestines were placed over her right shoulder. Part of her intestines were completely detached and placed between her body and left arm. Her left kidney and most of her uterus were missing. And this is really disturbing. But her face had been like terribly mutilated. Her nose was severed. Her cheeks slashed, and there were cuts through her eyelids.
God, it's hard to imagine, the level of rage and just pure evil that it would take to do something like that.
It is. And it seemed like with every murder, the violence got worse, which, just made the terror in London that much worse.
So at this point, did the police have any leads? Anything? Were they any closer to catching him?
Well, you can imagine the pressure they were under. London was in a full-blown panic. Everyone wanted answers, so they launched this massive investigation. They interviewed thousands of people, pursued every little lead they could find. But they were really limited by the technology of the time.
What do you mean?
Okay, so think about it. Forensic science was barely a thing back then. They didn't have the tools, the tests, the techniques that we have today to analyze evidence. And then the streets of Whitechapel. They were this maze. So it was almost impossible to find any real solid leads. And get this, Robert Anderson, he was the head of the criminal investigation department. He was on vacation during some of the murders.
He was on vacation during this. That's unbelievable.
Yeah, it wasn't ideal, that's for sure. But even with all that, the police were trying. They were working hard. One of the first things they did was focus on people whose jobs might have given them anatomical knowledge.
Like butchers or
Yeah,
surgeons.
exactly. They looked closely at anyone who, might have the skills to inflict those very precise and brutal mutilations. But after checking their alibis really carefully, most of them were ruled out.
So they were looking in the right places, but not finding what they needed. Did people just sit around and wait for the police to figure it out, though?
No, not at all. I mean, the murders kept happening. The fear was getting worse and worse. So the people of Whitechapel, they decided to do something themselves. They formed the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee. It was this group of, everyday people who were worried. They patrolled the streets, hoping to scare the killer off or, see something the police missed. They offered rewards for information and even hired their own private detectives.
Wow. That's amazing. They weren't just going to, sit back and be scared.
Nope. And that shows just how deeply this case affected everyone in London. This wasn't just some story in the paper. It was a real danger right there in their lives.
It's incredible. Even over a century later, people are still captivated by all of this. What do you think it is about Jack the Ripper that keeps us so fascinated?
It's probably a lot of things. I mean, there's the mystery, of course. We still don't know who he was, why he did what he did. And then there's the brutality of it all, how he targeted these women,
Right.
how he treated their bodies. And of course, the media frenzy, the way the newspapers made him into this larger-than-life monster.
Yeah.
All of that together, it created this story. And it's a story that's been captivating people for, well, over 100 years.
It's crazy. We've covered a lot already, but it feels like we've barely scratched the surface.
Oh, yeah. There's a lot more to this. And as we keep going, as we dig deeper, we're going to find even more mystery, even more intrigue.
So we were talking about the police investigation, how they were, really struggling to catch Jack the Ripper. But there's this other element to this case that's it's creepy, but also so fascinating. The letters.
The letters. Yeah, they're a huge part of this whole thing. They really show how obsessed the public was with this case. The police, during the investigation, they got hundreds of letters, a lot of them claiming to be from Jack the Ripper himself.
Hundreds, seriously.
Right.
Did they actually think any of them were real?
Most of them, no. Pretty obvious hoaxes or just people wanting attention. But there are three that really stand out. The Dear Boss letter, the Saucy Jackie postcard, and then there's the From Hell letter. That one's pretty chilling.
Okay, let's start with Dear Boss.
Yeah.
That's the one where the name Jack the Ripper first shows up.
Yep, that's the one. It was postmarked September 27th, 1888, addressed to the Central News Agency, and it got to Scotland Yard pretty quickly. Now, the writer, he signed it. Jack the Ripper taunted the police, said he was responsible for the murders and there were going to be more. He even threatened to cut off a victim's ears and send him to the police.
So was it really him,
Yeah.
the killer?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? It's been debated for over a century. Some people think it was, a real message from Jack the Ripper, his way of, like, inserting himself into the story, controlling how people saw him. But others think it was a hoax, maybe some journalist trying to sell more papers.
Okay. What about the Saucy Jackie postcard? What's the deal with that one?
That one came just a few days after Dear Boss, October 1st. The handwriting is similar, and it mentions the murders of Elizabeth Stride and Catherine Eddowes, the double event. He calls himself Saucy Jackie in this one, and refers to himself in the plural, signs off with, "Catch me when you can, Mr. Lusk."
Oh, God. It's like he's enjoying this, taunting them, reveling in the fear. It's creepy. Gives me goosebumps.
Yeah, it's pretty unsettling. And just like Dear Boss, no one's sure if it's real. Some say it was mailed before the murders were even public knowledge, which, if it's true, means the writer had to have known about them somehow. But others say it was just, time to take advantage of the public freaking out about the case.
Okay, and then there's the From Hell letter. This one sounds especially bad.
Yeah, this one was sent to George Lusk. He was the head of that Whitechapel Vigilance Committee. It got to him on October 16th. And with the letter, there was a small box.
Hold on. What was in the box? Don't leave me hanging.
Half a human kidney, preserved in ethanol.
Oh my God, that's horrifying. Are you serious?
And the letter said that the writer, Jack the Ripper, had fried and eaten the other half. Doctors examined the kidney, and it was definitely human. Probably from the left side of the body, which matches Catherine Eddowes. She was missing her left kidney.
That's just messed up. Beyond messed up. But was it really from the killer? I mean, could it have been like a prank or something?
That's another mystery, isn't it? Some people think it was, a real trophy, proof of just how twisted he was. But others think it was a sick joke, a way to make people even more scared and panicked.
Man, with all these letters and theories and everything going around, it must have been, I don't know, impossible for the police to know what was real and what wasn't.
Oh, yeah, for sure. Try to imagine you're trying to solve these murders, and the media is going crazy. Everyone's got a theory, journalists, regular people, everyone's an armchair detective. It must have been so chaotic, so confusing.
Yeah, you're right. And speaking of the media, it's kind of crazy how this case changed crime reporting forever. It was like the birth of tabloid journalism as we know it.
Totally. And it's still happening today. You get a catchy name, some gruesome details, bam, sells papers. Or today, gets those clicks and views, how the media covered the Ripper case. It became the template for how we consume true crime, focusing on the spectacle, the macabre, and forgetting about the victims a lot of the time.
Yeah, that's true. It's so easy to get lost in the mystery and the drama. But we got to remember, these were real people with their own lives, their own hopes and dreams.
You're absolutely right. And beyond the individual tragedies, the Ripper case, it had this big social impact, too. It made Victorian society look at the terrible conditions people were living in the East End.
Right, like the sources talk about poverty, overcrowding, lack of sanitation, all that.
Exactly. The murders, as horrible as they were, they kind of exposed how harsh life was for the poor and vulnerable. They brought attention to the slums, the bad housing, the fact that so many women had to turn to prostitution just to survive.
So it's like, in this really messed up way, Jack the Ripper, by highlighting these social problems, helped push for change.
In a way, yeah. People were outraged. The media was all over it. And all of that led to slum clearances and social reforms in the years after the murders. It's a weird legacy, isn't it? The murders were horrible, but they also started this movement for change, for a better, safer society.
Yeah, it's strange how the Ripper case can be both. Like a reflection of what people were scared of back then, and also this thing that pushed for progress. But even with all the changes, the fascination with Jack the Ripper, it never really went away, did it?
No, not at all. And that's interesting, too, why after more than 135 years are we still so drawn to this case?
Maybe because it's the ultimate unsolved mystery. And, I mean, everyone loves a good mystery, right? But it feels like there's more to it than that.
Yeah, I think so. It's become part of our culture, hasn't it? The Ripper case. It inspires so many books, movies, TV shows. There are even guided tours in Whitechapel. It's this myth, this legend that we can't seem to get enough of.
It's true. They even have a name for it, right? Ripperology, like a whole field dedicated to studying this case.
Yeah, that just shows how powerful this case is. And even though we might never know for sure who Jack the Ripper was, why he did what he did, that search for answers, it keeps the case alive.
I get it. The mystery is part of what makes it so compelling. But there are so many theories, so many suspects. Where do we even start?
Well, we could start by taking a look at some of the most talked about suspects.
Okay, now we're talking. This is what I want to hear about.
Now remember, there are over 100 suspects that people have pointed to over the years. It's impossible to go through them all. And a lot of these accusations are based on, speculation, circumstantial evidence, not really solid proof.
Oh yeah, of course. But still, it's got to be interesting to look at the possibilities. So who are some of the big names, the main suspects?
Well, one of the most interesting ones is a guy named Aaron Kosminski.
Kosminski, yeah, that name rings a bell.
He was a Polish Jewish immigrant who lived in Whitechapel when the murders were happening, and he was known to hate women, and he had mental health problems like uh, auditory hallucinations, paranoid delusions, stuff like that. Actually, he ended up in an asylum just a few years after the murders stopped.
Wow, so he kind of fits the profile, doesn't he?
Yeah.
Was there any direct evidence linking him to the crimes?
There was a witness who said they saw Kosminski with one of the victims right before she was murdered, but then the witness took it back, and there was no physical evidence connecting him to any of the crime scenes.
Another dead end, huh?
Yeah.
So who else were the police looking at?
Okay, another suspect who gets a lot of attention is Montague John Druitt.
Druitt. What's his story?
He was a barrister and a school teacher. He had a seemingly normal, respectable life, but he killed himself, drowned in the Thames, just a few weeks after Mary Jane Kelly's murder.
That's definitely suspicious. Did the police think he was the Ripper?
One of the main investigators, Melvin McNaughton, he thought Druitt was the most likely suspect. He said that Druitt killing himself happened right when the murders stopped, and that Druitt's family had a history of mental illness.
So another possible link to mental instability. But was there any real proof that Druitt did it?
Sadly, no. There was nothing tying him to the crime scenes. And the timing of his suicide, yeah, it's suspicious, but it could just be a coincidence. Some people think his family actually pushed the whole Druitt as Ripper thing to cover up that he was gay, which was a huge scandal back then.
So we're back to square one, more questions than answers.
Yeah.
It's wild how this case is still so mysterious.
Yeah, it is, but that's part of what makes it so fascinating, right? It's a puzzle. And it keeps challenging us, keeps making us look at the evidence in new ways and think about new possibilities.
Okay, so we talked about Kosminski and Druitt, but the sources also mentioned this other guy, Thomas Cutbush. Who was he?
Thomas Cutbush was a young guy, worked as a butcher's assistant. He was really into surgery and anatomy, and he had these delusions, thought people were trying to poison him.
So another possible connection to anatomy and to mental illness. Was he ever a serious suspect?
He was for a while, yeah. And some people who study the case now, they think he's a strong possibility. But just like the others, there's no hard evidence linking him to the murders.
It's like we're going around in circles, always close, but never finding that missing piece.
Yeah, it's frustrating, isn't it? But it's also what keeps us coming back. It's why, after all this time, people are still trying to solve the mystery of Jack the Ripper.
It's true. It's like this historical whodunit that we just can't put down. But okay, beyond who he was, there's the question of why. Why did he do this? What would make someone do something so horrible?
That's probably the hardest question of all. And since we don't know who he was, it's impossible to say for sure. But we can look at what we do know, the crimes, and try to figure out what it might mean.
Okay, what do you mean? Like, what kind of things can we figure out?
Well, the way he killed these women. How brutal it was, the specific way he mutilated their bodies. It all points to this intense rage and hatred towards women. Some people have said maybe he had some trauma in his past, something bad that happened to him, maybe involving a woman, and that's what triggered all this.
So maybe he was, trying to get revenge or punish women.
Could be. Other people think the mutilations, especially the fact that he removed organs, could mean he was, really messed up psychologically. Maybe he was obsessed with anatomy, or maybe he wanted to, like, possess and control these women even after they were dead.
God, that's a scary thought. It's like he was, like, taking something from them,
Yeah.
leaving his mark on them in the most awful way imaginable.
Yeah. The violence, the precision of the cuts, the specific organs he took, it all points to him planning this, being in control. And that's really disturbing.
So it wasn't just random. It was planned, deliberate. God, that makes it even scarier.
It does. And it's one of the reasons why why it still gets to us, even after all this time.
There's just so much to think about. Is there anything else we can, I don't know, get from the evidence to try to understand why he did it?
Well, some researchers think the letters, even if some of them are fake, they might tell us something about the killer's mind.
The letters? What do you mean?
Even if he didn't write them all himself, they were written to sound like him, like his voice, his personality,
Yeah.
and they show this arrogance, like he wanted to control the story, to taunt the police.
It's like he wanted to be famous,
Yeah.
to be feared.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And that's something that still fascinates us about serial killers, isn't it? That need for attention, for everyone to know their name. It seems like it's a big part of what drives them.
It's like they want to, I don't know, leave their mark on the world, even if it's a mark of terror, of violence.
That's exactly it. And it's disturbing to think about. But it also makes you realize that even in the worst parts of human nature, there's this need to connect, to matter, to mean something, even if it's in a really messed up way.
We've talked a lot about the killer, but I want to know more about the world he was living in. The East End back then, late 1800s, it was a place of, like, extreme poverty, so much inequality. Did that environment have anything to do with the Ripper's crimes?
Oh, absolutely. That's really important to consider. The way society was back then, it played a big role in this whole thing. The East End was a tough place. Overcrowded slums, people struggling to survive, danger everywhere. And for women, especially the ones who turned to prostitution to get by, it was even worse.
Yeah, I mean, these women were already vulnerable,
Yeah.
living on the edge of society.
Exactly. And that made them easy targets for someone like Jack the Ripper.
The East End, it was dark, anonymous, the perfect hunting ground for a predator.
Man, that's just sad. These women, they were already fighting to survive, and then they become victims of this horrible violence.
It's a tragedy. We got to remember they were real people with their own lives, their own families, their own stories, and they were taken from the world in such a brutal way. Yeah, it's easy to get caught up in the mystery, in the intrigue, but we can't forget the human cost, the real people who were hurt.
That's true. And it's also important to remember that the Ripper case, it changed things. It had a big impact on society and politics in Victorian London.
How so? Like, in what way?
Well, the murders, they forced people to see the really bad parts of the city, the inequality, the poverty, the crime, the desperation, all of that stuff that was happening in the East End.
So it's like the Ripper case was this horrible thing, but it also kind of, like, revealed the truth about Victorian society, all the bad stuff that was hidden underneath.
Exactly. And it sparked change. People started demanding better living conditions, better sanitation, more police protection for those who needed it.
So the murders, even though they were awful, they ended up having some good consequences. In the long run, I mean.
Yeah, in a way. The Ripper case became this catalyst for social reform, which led to, better housing, sanitation, public safety, all that, especially in the East End. It's a weird legacy. But it's important to see both sides of it, the good and the bad that came out of these events.
Yeah, I'm starting to see that this whole Jack the Ripper story, it's not just some true crime story. It's a look into a specific time and place.
Yeah.
It shows us the fears people had back then, their anxieties, but also their hopes.
That's a really insightful way to look at it, and it's a big part of why this case is still so fascinating to us. It's not just about solving the mystery. It's about understanding ourselves, our history, and all the dark things that shape our world.
I like that. So, okay, here we are. We've explored the murders, the victims, the suspects, the letters, the media, the whole social impact of this case. And still, the big question remains, who is Jack the Ripper? And why did he do it?
Those are the questions, aren't they? The ones that keep us coming back. And even though we might never have the answers, that search for answers, it's what keeps the case alive. It makes it just as relevant, just as terrifying today as it was over a century ago.
It's amazing to think about, how powerful this case is, even after all this time. It's a reminder that the past, it's never really gone.
Yeah.
And that the darkness that was there in Victorian London, it's still around, even today.
That's a powerful thought, and it's something we should all keep in mind as we keep exploring the mysteries of the
Oh,
past.
wow, we've really gone deep on this one, haven't we? Down the dark alleys and all the twists and turns of the Jack the Ripper case. It's amazing, all these stories, the victims, the suspects, those creepy letters. But man, it's a lot to process.
It is, and it's easy to get lost in the details, but there are some bigger ideas here, some things we should think about.
Yeah, you're right. We talked about how the media went crazy over this case and how that basically turned Jack the Ripper into a legend. I don't know, do you think he'd be as famous today if it wasn't for all that, if the newspapers hadn't made it such a huge deal?
That's a good question. I mean, think about it. Back then, all those newspapers, they were competing with each other, trying to get more readers. And they saw this case and they ran with it. They turned Jack the Ripper into this monster hiding in the fog. They exaggerated everything, printed all sorts of crazy theories, and they gave him that name, Jack the Ripper, which, stuck.
Exactly. It was like they created this villain, someone for everyone to be afraid of and obsessed with, almost like he was a character in some gruesome story.
Yeah, exactly. And that all that hype, it really affected how the case was investigated and how people saw it. It created this panic, this fear. And honestly, it might have even made it harder for the police to actually find the real killer.
I hadn't thought about it that way. Maybe all the attention, all the speculation, it kind of like clouded the truth.
Yeah, maybe. It makes you think, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Would we even remember Jack the Ripper today if it wasn't for all those headlines, those letters? Would he just be some forgotten name in history?
Wow. Yeah, that's a really good point. I guess we'll never know. But it does make you wonder how much of the Ripper's fame is real and how much
Yeah.
is just the media telling a good story.
Yeah. It's a good reminder to always be careful about the information we get, even or maybe especially when it comes to true crime. We gotta separate the facts from the
Yeah.
fiction, see through the hype.
You're totally right. And that's even harder now with social media and the news being on 24/7.
Mhm.
It's so easy to get swept up in all the craziness
Yeah.
and forget about the real people at the center of it all.
Yeah, you're right. But even with all that, even with all the hype and the speculation, there's something about this case, about Jack the Ripper, that still gets to us, even after all this time.
It's true. It's like it touches on something, I don't know, something deep inside us,
Mhm.
something that scares us.
I think you're right. It's the fear of the unknown, the darkness that can be hiding in normal people, the fact that we're all vulnerable. Those are the things that are just as true today as they were back then.
And maybe that's why we keep coming back to it, trying to understand, trying to figure out why, what made him do it.
Maybe we're trying to make sense of something that doesn't make sense, to find some meaning in the chaos. And even though we might never solve it, never really know who Jack the Ripper was, that search that keeps the case
Kind of
alive.
like a puzzle. You can't put it down, even if you might never, find all the pieces.
Exactly. And in trying to solve it, we learn something about ourselves, about the dark side that we all have. We have to face that darkness, not just in the past, but in the present too.
Man, that's a powerful thought. So where do we go from here? I mean, we've explored the mystery, the history, the impact it had on society. What's the takeaway for our listeners? What should they be thinking about as they, keep learning about Jack the Ripper?
I think the biggest thing to remember is that this case, it's about more than just some scary guy from the past. It's a reminder that evil can be anywhere, even in places that seem safe, even in good people. It's a reminder to be careful, to protect the people who need protecting, and to never stop searching for the truth.
Absolutely. That's a great way to put it. And on that note, we're going to leave you with one last thought, something to think about. Would Jack the Ripper be as famous today if they had caught him, if we knew who he was? Or is it the mystery, the not knowing that really makes him so powerful? Until next time, keep exploring, keep asking questions, and thanks for taking this deep dive with us.